the title for my talk is Whose Turn Is It Now? Educational and Reputational Economies. And it's quite a complicated set of ideas I need to deliver in a very compressed period of time. So I'm going to talk very fast, and I apologise in advance. So this is what I'm going to try and get through. General context. What is this thing called the educational turn? What kind of rhetorical tensions are emerging between gallery education and these other modes of practice? And can this idea of reputational economy help us to understand why these tensions are emerging? So general context, very quickly. We are experiencing a neoliberal project to remake formal education, create markets, impose audit cultures, define education in terms of the production of a flexible, precarious working subject who's constantly reinventing themselves, to define this in good rhetoric, creativity, etc. In informal education, we see this project incredibly successfully in the media, and any of you who watch a little bit of television these days will be clear on this really aggressive program of education that's telling us how to shop, how to invest in property, how to make money out of the antiques in the attic, how to be a superstar, how to achieve fame. And the basic model that underpins formal and informal pedagogies of neoliberalism is the human capital model, which says, invest in yourself, get a better return on your life, and you live yourself as a project. This sets up all kinds of contradictions. So those of us engaged in the attempt to produce autonomous education are caught up in operating in proxy markets where we compete with each other to sell services, to fill in the gaps that government identifies as necessary to fill, and so forth. So it sets up contradictions, and we live those contradictions. Sometimes it's hard for us to name those contradictions. Against this backdrop, some art practices have increasingly started to talk about education. So, for example, Documenta 11 has, as one of the three themes, education. The artist Raymond Ganal, arbitrary example, Austrian artist based in New York, who's making work about the conditions under which knowledge is produced. But what's really important is a shift from this work that is about education to projects that actually happen as artworks realised through an educational practice. So Raymond Ganal, instead of just documenting people doing teaching, he sets up reading groups and so forth and begins to actualise educational activity as artwork. So the educational turn is the term that we've proposed, myself and my colleague Paul O'Neill. We've proposed this term to describe the turn to use educational practices as constitutive of the artwork or the curatorial platform. Examples, very quickly. Annette Krauss, Hidden Curriculum, working with school children in order not to look at what they're learning in school, but what knowledges they have about how to subvert the experience of school. So how to cheat, how to get around the school situation. Anton Badokla, Russian artist based in New York, who was part of the Manifesta 6 team that pitched the idea of an experimental art school as the Manifesta 6 Nicosia didn't happen, but subsequently set up the United Nations Plaza, which was a year-long art school in the form of an exhibition, or exhibition in the form of an art school, and a hugely important and very widely discussed and controversial project. Para-Education Initiative in the Netherlands by Annie Fletcher and Sarah Pearce, an attempt to construct a counter-institution out of the intersection of two independent gallery spaces, and something that self-consciously sets itself up as the opposite of traditional gallery education, but also sets itself up as an artwork. Just these couple of examples that I'm going to flash through are really indicating, there it's Budapest, here it's Puerto Rico. This is a project in Ireland by a researcher I work with called Hedge School Project. This deals with ideas of literacy, but also it's a practice around notions of equality, where instead of an anti-racist practice, what is proposed is that you just simply assert everybody in this place is from this place, and you proceed from there. Same guy, different place. This is a project he realised in Economies in Lithuania, and this project examined the conditions of precariat labour. And what emerged was that the Lithuanian state official level of poverty is here, and the official minimum wage is here. And what this school did was, for the first time, brought those two facts together in the public domain. So these programs of art as educational practice do not always take the form of school or alternative school. This project here by Paul O'Neill is in the form of a symposium in a nightclub where DJs and lecturers both do their thing, but then they have to swap. So a DJ has to give a lecturer has to play a DJ set, and within a nightclub context where people are drinking, so the thing pretty quickly degenerates. So the idea is the form collapses. If you want to know more about these, there's lots of places you can go. One place you can go is this online resource that's been compiled by a young artist in New York called Teachable File, and this is a website that just lists and provides links to lots and lots of these projects. Another great resource is this book that was co-edited by myself and Paul O'Neill, and we did this as a contribution to a debate rather than as the final statement. When we launched this book last year in London as part of the Deschooling Society conference, it was launched at one of these experimental spaces, the Centre for Possible Studies in London, and on the same evening, this book was launched, or these two books were presented by Carmen Morse. I know that Carmen will be well known to many of you as a champion of a particular vision of a critical gallery education project. And Carmen is now also working with Manifesta on this idea of the educational turn. But what I want you to notice is just the way in which it's glossed. So, current developments in art mediation and exhibition settings. So, that's a kind of a different idea of what the educational turn is. It's not art practices as education. It's the chance for gallery education to maybe take centre stage, at least in this reading. And what I'm suggesting is that we're seeing some tensions emerge in the contest over who has priority. And Felicity Allen's recent book just came out in September, and I'm sure you've all been aware of it, but it is a really important contribution to this debate. But opening up in the introduction, she kind of identifies some of the tensions, and she says, it is difficult to maintain any consistent distinction between teaching activities and art practice. It is understandable, though, that those with nominally distinct professional identities can often fail to understand each other's terms and standards, and she proceeds to identify a number of problems. And one of the problems she identifies is art critics who tend only to acknowledge art as pedagogy if it is mediated through an exhibition-based model. So I'm suggesting in these we can begin to hear something of a tension being played out about who gets to be included and who gets to own this idea of an educational turn, this idea that contemporary cultural practice is marked in some very profound way by an appeal to educational praxis as a form of art production. And just to reinforce that, one of the prominent quotes in the book is by the Cuban artist Tania Bruguera, and she says, I'm not interested in art as education, I'm interested in exploring the ways in which things become art. I'm interested in seeing what makes a moment art, a moment that comes from the realm of the political. So I would suggest within this we're sensing a tension, yeah? And I want to kind of indicate a little bit more of what that tension might be. One of the contributions to the book that Paul and myself edited was by the Danish critic and curator Simon Sheikh. And Simon Sheikh wrote a piece based on a performance artwork by the American performance artist Andrea Fraser. And this piece, Museum Highlights, a gallery talk, where she takes on the role of a docent and provides this walking tour of the gallery. And he makes a claim that these educational practices are problematic because they fail to recognize the fundamental pedagogy that's already operative within the what's called the exhibitionary institution within the whole mode of address of the museum, the gallery, and so forth. I mean, this is an argument you'll all be familiar with from the work of Tony Bennett, Carl Becker, and many others. So he comes to this proposition. In any case, the curatorial cannot be distinctly separated from the process of mediation, and outreach programs can never truly reach out, never really be adequate in the sense of political subjectivity and agency without a reconsideration of the whole practice of exhibition making and instituting, since an exhibition not only represents artworks, but also represents social subjects. Now, that's a very compressed kind of argument, but what he's saying is that institutions don't just talk to people who are already there. Institutions produce those people, produce subject positions, produce ways of being a person experiencing your world. And because of that work, the other kind of activities that are layered or twined through that are already caught in the initial action of the production of a particular kind of social position by the whole apparatus of the art institution. So what I want to do is just to dig a little bit deeper into this tension, and I'm drawing on Carmen's introduction to the second volume in the Documenta series. So this is a research project coming out of the Documenta to do with the education initiatives of the last Documenta. And in this, Carmen provides a really, really important argument about 4 different strands or 4 different discourses within gallery education. She calls them affirmative, reproductive, deconstructive, and transformative. The affirmative and the reproductive ones are the ones we kind of know and are familiar with: affirming, showing, prompting; reproductive, trying to increase and extend and produce new audience. The deconstructive and the transformative ones, she suggests, are less common, but they point to a critical practice, they point to a critical practice that attempts to interrogate and reform the institution itself. And I am very sympathetic to Carmen's project, but I think there's a problem, and I want to read a little bit from it to give you a sense of the problem. And actually, it's this bit here. Curators meet gallery education with increasing and genuine interest, with high expectations, albeit frequently with little expertise. In best-case scenario, curators realise their deficit in this regard and commission experts to develop gallery educational programs. Now, this goes hand in hand with the claim that in producing the gallery educator, we're not producing an expert who's going to tell people in the audience what they should think when they stand in front of an artwork. But the expertise is kind of coming back in through the back door, because when I'm talking to a sophisticated, fully enlisted member of the art world like a curator, well, suddenly I do have expertise, and I have to marshal it and let them know that they can't just walk all over me because I'm a gallery educator and I know stuff. So that tension around expertise, I think, is indicative of a problem, a contradiction that's not being fully thematized, that's not being fully drawn out. And I want to try and explain why it might not be fully drawn out by drawing in this idea of a reputational economy. The idea of a reputational economy is an idea that was developed back in the early 80s by people involved in management and organizational studies, and what it describes is a way of organizing work. In a reputational economy, the opportunity to work and the reward for doing work is mediated through reputation. If I get to do a job, if I get to be in a show, my reputation goes up, and that's the reward. But how do I get to be in the show? If I have a bit of reputation. So reputation is a key mechanism for managing the allocation of work opportunities, and it's the reward for the work done. And an example of a reputational economy would be the academic world. It tends to be self-policing to a great extent, but that's a formal reputational economy driven by PhDs and other kinds of awards and professorships, which are managed very formally through institutions. And there's an informal dimension, but the formal dimension tends to be overriding. The art world is a great example of an informal reputational economy. The gigs we get as artists are driven by reputation. And the whole kind of group show phenomenon is a great mechanism for transfer and enhancement of reputation. The old fading star shows in a group show with the young rising new coming star, and they get the reputation for being current still, and the young rising star it's clear that they are rising, because now they're in the company of the great old artist. So academia and the art world are reputational economies of different types. I would contrast this with service economies. So in service economies, there tends to be much less control of working opportunities and working conditions by the people who do the work. So if you're getting a sandwich, the person delivering that sandwich doesn't really have a great amount of say in the production of the work circumstances, and in their standing or reputation is not a bearer of whether they get the next gig or not. It works very differently. Now, clearly, I would suggest to you that gallery education has historically been produced as a service economy, and what is happening is there's an attempt to try and bring it into a reputational economy so that the reputation becomes the mechanism for rewarding the work done. We get better status, but it also becomes the means by which we get other opportunities to work, that it becomes recognized as a professional activity and not as a service activity. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to explain what the connection is between this analysis of reputational economy and the different ways in which gallery education and these curatorial and artistic practices produce themselves. Now, what I'm talking about is not the real differences. What I'm talking about is the rhetorical production of differences. Not because rhetoric is false, but because rhetoric is productive. Rhetoric is one of the things that produces how we are in the world. And one of the key differences in the rhetorical production of gallery education and the rhetorical production of these art practices that we've labelled the educational term is that within the attempt to produce a project of critical gallery education, there's an attempt to produce a shared project, a project that many people are asked to sign up to and participate in, and something that has an element of expertise. The people in this room know something that people in other rooms don't know. And that becomes important. Whereas the rhetorical formulas used by most of the practitioners engaged in this field of art practice as education tends to be about producing not expertise, but attitude. It's a particular performance of attitude. And much of that attitude is about saying, I am doing something very different. Okay? It becomes really important in contemporary art, reputational economy, not to be the same as most of the people around you, because otherwise you're not going to get the gig. You have to be special and different. So there's a lot of pressure on you to produce yourself as radically other. The project of gallery education is consistently produced in a rhetoric that says the institutional ground is where we want to be. We want to be in an institutional ground. We might want to reach out of our building, but we want to stay inside our institution in the sense that institution is not building. Institution are the things like the conditions of employment. Institution is like the guarantee of a social reproduction of your status. You don't have to tell people you're really special as a gallery educator. The institution reproduces that and does that work. Most of the projects, like United Nations Plaza, like Para Education, like Tanya Bergera's work even, most of these projects form themselves as counter-institutional. Now, very often they draw institutional resources. They're done by people who have one foot in an institution and one foot somewhere else. But rhetorically, the emphasis is on counter-institution. It's not that I'm going to do this gig and then be picked up by Tate Modern. It's that I am saying, I here constitute myself as a piece of the social world that matters and must be attended to, and I claim the right to produce meaning. There's a very interesting difference in the rhetorical use of history. So there's a project, a very important project, to reconstruct the history of gallery education. I saw a wonderful paper recently by Wendy Woon, who is the Education Director of MoMA in New York, and she's been in that role for 5 years. They've just got their archives back from when there was a Department of Education between 34 and 67. And in this archive, there's evidence of an incredible experimentation in gallery education, a volume of work that's completely underrepresented. And so there's a big project to try and reconstruct this history, because it will actually redefine our understanding of the history of exhibition itself. So this is an important project, and the way in which it happens within gallery education is to say there's a long history, and that gives us legitimacy. The opposite approach happens in the historical thinking of the production of the educational turn, where people try to present themselves as having historical relationships, thin genealogies, Paulo Freire, Rancière, so they have relationships like that, but they disavow more embedded, sustained histories. For example, in the 18th century, the Salon in Paris there was a very strong initiative to try and recruit the lower orders into gallery spaces to produce speech, to discourse within the space of the museum. So there's clearly more complicated histories that are being disavowed in one case, but there's also a disavowal in gallery education, because one of the things that emerges in the history of gallery education in MoMA is that it was part of the Cold War diplomatic politics. So MoMA exported a whole load of art carnivals, these incredibly huge art events that involved children in incredibly productive activities. But it was done as part of the geopolitic maneuvering and positioning of American culture, and it's quite explicit. But that bit of the history is not favoured. What we prefer is the account which talks about gallery education as about equity, as having roots in feminism, as having roots in the kind of counterculture and so forth. And it's not that that trajectory isn't true, it's just that we are involved in historical reconstructions that are motivated in both cases, but they're motivated differently and they operate rhetorically differently. I'm almost finished. I think another difference is that within the discourses of gallery education, you have a very explicit sense of status anxiety. There's an explicit naming of, we have been marginalised, we don't get our fair share of the attention, and now that education is being all sexed up again as an interesting place to be in culture, we're not getting a due recognition of the role we've played. Whereas within the discourse of these practitioners within the educational turn, what one tends to see is an implicit but not avowed status anxiety. So artists don't go, I'm really worried that I'm not going to recognise as an artist. What they go is, I'm an artist, I'm doing this, it's art. I produce my own legitimacy from within the assertion of my identity. I might be nervous and have concerns and want to really hope that you believe me, but that's not the rhetorical mode I inhabit when I produce myself before you and say, hello, I'm an artist. Finally, and I think this is perhaps the most important difference, in spite of the attempt within the project of critical gallery education to talk about anti-racism, queer politics and so forth, there's a strong tendency within the discourse of gallery education to favour a broad liberal politic that speaks of inclusion. It names exclusions as something that are there but must be overcome. The difference, and this is a profound difference, the practices that we've assembled under the head of the educational turn, for the most part, recognize or claim to recognize that any moment of inclusion, any moment of setting the project up, of setting oneself up to do something in this world, necessitates moments of exclusion. And so they accept an agonistic politic as intrinsic to the action of any cultural self-production. Now, there's a further dimension to this, which is the question of public. I don't think that these people are interested in the idea of art making a good public. What they're interested in, many of them, is the idea that art would reinstate the idea of publicness, not not produce good publics, but produce the conditions of publicness, which is where the contest, the refusals, the missing each other, talking past each other, not getting each other, ignoring each other, can achieve meaning. And this is a really complicated idea. I'm not going to be able to do it justice here, but I think it's a really important distinction. Not the production of publics, but the production of something called publicness, which is a fundamental category of the political imagination of the West for 2,500 years. And it's a category that we have seen evacuated down to the idea of publicity. It's something you can see, or it's something you can get into for free, or it's a space that's open. That's public. And that evacuated idea of public has lost from it this incredible resource for political imagination in the West. So I'll just leave this last slide up for a moment because it's something that I've always come back to in my work, is the difficulty we have as educators, as cultural workers, as artists, as curators, of inhabiting a fundamentally conflicted, contradictory space. The difficulty we have in avowing these contradictions and the rush sometimes to seek a pure position, particularly in a circumstance like this where we produce ourselves and present a good face. The problem with this is that if we refuse to acknowledge these contradictions, they become all the more powerful. And it is only possible for contradictions to be moved, kept mobile. They can never be fully resolved. We just need to keep the contradictions mobile so that they don't freeze and paralyze us. So there's a contradiction in the different rhetorical productions of gallery education and of these curatorial and artistic practices. These contradictions are not a problem to be smoothed over. They are a rich resource for thinking and understanding the world and to be worked through. And I would propose that we don't try and take sides here, but rather we try to think through to where a new, more interesting contradiction could emerge. Thank you very much.